So, WoW tier lists are kind of sort of insane. I have been playing WoW Classic and I forgot how toxic I become when I start playing World of Warcraft. World of Warcraft just has this appeal to me where when I start playing it, my mind just becomes subsumed by the politics, the Game of Thrones of the video game. And it's crazy because it's real. And we're going to talk about that in this video. So the first thing that I want to talk about is how WoW tier list content reveals an interesting balance of objective data, subjective individual belief, and a super ego of a society that communicates mainly through chat. So if you've ever played the game of World of Warcraft, you'll know that you have a number of classes to choose from to play your character at what we call endgame. These classes all have different abilities that allow them to do different things in the scope of combat. Some of them are tanks, some of them are healers, some of them are damage dealers. It's the general Dungeons and Dragons trope. However, there's also two main types of combat in World of Warcraft that operate very differently, and we're going to talk about those two, which are PvP and PvE. PvP stands for player versus player content, which is basically two players beating the shit out of each other, right? That's PvP content, and more or less in the World of Warcraft, where it's just like me versus you, and you have your buttons and I have my buttons, and whoever comes out on top with health at the end of it is the winner. On the other side of content, we have PvE, and PvE is basically you team up with a bunch of other players to take down a boss encounter. And the idea is that the boss will incrementally get stronger over time because your healers are running out of mana and your tanks are holding threat, and the DPS is happening, and there's a bunch of mechanics, and there's an enrage mechanic. But basically the main thing in PvE is to work together to defeat something that your character wouldn't be able to do on its own. And that actually makes for a very interesting dynamic. You see, the main engine of World of Warcraft isn't the player base, actually, it's perception. And let me tell you why that is the case, in my opinion. So perception is baked into an unbalanced and extremely complex systems of buffs, luck, and Blizzard's attempt to balance the mechanics while making players feel like heroes. Basically what this means is that as a player, you pay Blizzard $15 a month to play whatever the latest expansion is that you're playing, right? So Blizzard has a system where they have to basically adapt to the whims of the players to make sure that certain classes don't get too overpowered, make sure that certain classes don't stay too underpowered, as well as just kind of like micromanaging all of the different things that they add into the game, where people will use these things called world buffs, for example, and these world buffs will change how their class is functionally played, right? Like in certain classes get more benefit from buffs than others, and there's different debuffs. There's like different bosses that have different mechanics that favor or disfavor certain people's classes. And basically what this leads to is an extremely complex system where Blizzard just has to juggle percentages of characters' classes and say like, okay, if the player hits this button, then we need it to operate under this modifier unless they have this buff, in which case it changes everything, right? So that also leads to party dynamics, because then people are interested in inviting people to their party that help buff their class more than another class. So what this leads to actually it's a system that's kind of half reality, but also mainly baked into perception. So the pilot behind the character is operating one of the many of the same class, right? So there's only 10 classes, but many people can play Druid at once, for example, but they might have different reaction times, affinity to the class, the role, etc. So what this also causes is this ability for people to basically segment classes in their mind, given how good they are in a variety of situations, which is driven both by data and anecdotal. And that leads us to the main subject of this video, tier lists. What you'll see here in this tier list, for example, is people will take their list of classes, specifically the list of specs that each class can do, and then compare them directly against each other in all forms of content, in PvP and PvE, in certain raids, and how fun they are, and how hard it is to pick up. Example, these things are addicting as hell. Like it's really hard to like mentally look at a tier list video and not have it affect you on a deep level, especially when the game is so close to a person's identity when they come with class choice, right? People don't like thinking that they chose wrong, the same way that you go to a restaurant and you order a burger and you're like, that looks really good, or your friend orders a burger and you order whatever, a salad, and you're like, I should have got the burger. I don't know what I was thinking. I should have got the burger. As a matter of fact, there's a video from I Think You Should Leave about that. In this skit, this character is upset with his choice of not having chose the burger, and basically they really overplay the idea of he starts eating the burger and then ropes everybody into it, and he tries to make it look like he's the good guy type situation when he's obviously being the bad guy. So this happens, I think, with WoW content creation, with tier lists unintentionally. I don't think tier list creators are intentionally setting out to make people feel bad, but it's really hard to not feel bad when you feel a certain affinity towards a certain class and role, but then you're told by your community that your class is garbage, right? And if your class is garbage, that fuels the perception even more and reinforces the perception that the class is garbage, meaning that the next person who will make a tier list is more likely to put your class on a garbage F tier as opposed to a Chad S tier. In sum, I mean, this hold is almost impossible to ignore fully unless you're willing to operate in bliss, bliss of simming, Warcraft logs, Wowhead, etc. And the irony of World of Warcraft is that it is at its core a min-maxing game due to the kind of complex system of buffs and debuffs, the luck of your critical strike, the fact that you need the tribal knowledge to know that you need a certain amount of what we call hit percentage to even hit the boss in the first place. Every character basically has a stat sheet like this where they literally changes the scope of their gameplay and lowers their DPS by a massive amount that nobody would want to queue with them in PvE content, and they would get completely wiped by everybody in PvP content and not necessarily know why. So it's actually impossible to live completely in bliss at end level, right? Like you can pretty much level in the game and not really participate in this perception kind of spiral vortex that happens amongst all of the other players. But if you want to play end game, you need to be able to play the game. You need to be able to play the political Game of Thrones. So I think that this reveals an interesting paradigm of how MMOs are balanced in the first place, how people react to unfair realities, and how stories promulgate into myth. And specifically, I want to talk about, I think this is actually, funnily enough, a World of Warcraft Wrath of the Lich King tier list, which is great because I wanted to talk about a few classes in particular. So what you'll see up here on the second one right here is the Frost Mage. So the Frost Mage is a interesting case because it's S tier in what we call PvP, but would be pretty low tier in a lot of other content. And that's interesting, right? Because PvP is technically zero sum. There's always going to be a player that wins and a player that loses. And if you're the player that wins, then you come out on top. And if you're the player that loses, then you are dead, right? Like that's the kind of like your rating goes up and their rating goes down. So in that sense, a tier list might make more sense, right? Because you can almost imagine it as a data game of rock, paper, scissors. But the thing is that this can tell any story, right? If a Frost Mage is piloted by a terrible player and played against the best rogue or even the class that it kind of quote unquote scissors to rock in rock, paper, scissors, a warrior, they're going to get stomped. And they're not necessarily going to know why they got stomped, right? Because their class is S tier and the warrior is A tier. Like S should always beat A, right? But that's what I'm trying to say, is that the big data that comes from Warcraft logs, this data from Warcraft logs tells a whole story while also telling half of the story, right? It tells you these people's gear score. It tells you the class compositions of different end-game content or different raid tiers, and it changes from raid tier to raid tier. And it also shows you the kind of buffs and debuffs that they brought with them and how well they did. So when a player sees this information, they're going to feel like, oh, I should be able to do equally as well as the top performing Death Knight on my server, which is ridiculous, right? Because as we know, there's so many other factors that go into it. There's the players themselves, the latency of that day, the group composition, the different like kind of quote unquote cheesing mechanics that happen in like PvP and PvE, where certain players can take advantage of the complex system to make themselves look better or worse. As we said, if you don't have a hit cap laid out, right, you're just not going to be able to operate at the level of acuity that a player who does have that stat line does. And then I think that to really drive this point home, I was talking about with my friends in Discord about this very concept where better DPS in raids usually gets what we call gear priority, right? Because they are the top priority to gear so that they can help the raid even further, right? So it's like, I'm better DPS, so I get first priority for gear. So I get better DPS. So I get first priority for gear. So I get better DPS, right? You can start to see this cycle, right? You can say that like once characters kind of get better, it only really kind of just hammers in this perception and it just keeps going and it really kind of creates an environment where where again, people are constantly left thinking like, oh, maybe I should re-roll an alt. Maybe the class that I chose wasn't good enough. I think this reveals an interesting kind of story about human nature in general, right? As well. Like there is a interesting kind of thread here about how people operate in kind of game theory in a playground, right? So in the real world, there's just so many variables to min max that it's almost a useless waste of time. So in these games, you can min max, right? You can say, oh, if I select this talent over that talent, then my DPS might go up 55% or something like along those lines. And you'll feel a very real, tangible impact to every decision that you make. But when you have a very tangible impact to every decision that you make, your brain will never be satisfied with the decisions that you make. So look, I'm talking about all these tier lists, but I am totally and utterly obsessed. I've been watching every tier list that I can get my hands on, and it has been affecting how I play my characters and the classes that I chose. Not even just for enjoyment of play, but like this kind of idea of like even the population of a server, where you can literally see, for example, here that different servers get so imbalanced because people are under the perception that, oh, well, Alliance is better on this server, so I'll just be Alliance. And then everybody else is like, well, there's so many Alliance, so I should be Alliance. Well, then everyone else is like, well, there's more Alliance, so I should be Alliance. Until you end up with a server that's 99.6% Alliance. And the same thing happens for classes, the same thing happens for specs. The only thing that prevents specs from reaching 99.9% or 100% is that it can't really, you get, like, groups won't work. You can't have a group of players if you have a 99% of them are all playing Warlock, right, for example. So I just think it's interesting that the political kind of game that happens in World of Warcraft and the actual very real data game of saying, oh, well, I have access to this button, that's going to make me a better or worse player. But I do have some kind of open questions about the scope of kind of WoW tier lists in general. If WoW were perfectly balanced, what would class participation look like? I don't know that it would actually all even out, right? Because then it would just purely be a matter of preference. And preference is interesting because people prefer to be overpowered as to being underpowered. Some people like being the underdog because they have like kind of weird masochistic or sadistic streak. I always forget which is which. The streak where they like to hurt themselves. But most people are going to want to choose the more powerful class. So I don't know what class participation would look like, or if people would even play the game, honestly. I think it's these small imbalances that actually drive people to want to play World of Warcraft. Here's another question. What level of perception is most important? This is kind of interesting because basically what I'm trying to get at here is that there are different levels of perception within the level of WoW perception. There's the perception of your guild, which is saying, hey, we don't need any more feral druids, so re-roll to a class so you can get invited to our raids. Then there's the perception of your server, right? So your server might have a million feral druids. So you can't be a feral druid because the best feral druid obviously isn't you, and that person is going to be invited to everything and you're not going to be invited to everything. And then there's just the party that just wiped in this very specific instance that you're in, right? Or the PvP battleground where you're like, oh, I queued in with a bunch of losers again. Like, this is a L game. Like, this is my third game in a row that I've lost. But again, that's totally anecdotal and it's totally perceived. Just because you did, in fact, lose 3 games in a row doesn't mean that your faction, in fact, lost 3 games in a row. It means that you lost 3 games in a row, right? So that's the interesting, again, balance of this anecdotal and very real perception that happens in the WoW game. And then finally, this is a bigger question that actually applies to the broader scope of journalism in general, is do you trust your data? Is it giving you the full picture? So when you see this hit rating, for example, you can trust that Blizzard's system is going to be fair when it decides to say like, okay, you have enough hit rating to hit the boss. You're not going to miss the boss. I will never calculate a miss for you. You shouldn't see a miss number on your screen. But you can't really trust this data because this is drawn from data, right? Like this is drawn from content creators who have very valid points and might have spent years studying this Warcraft logs data and looking at DPS meters for weeks at a time. But it's overall going to be anecdotal because they don't have all of the data and they can't get all of the data and they can't be in control of a situation that is in itself a complex, ever-evolving system. So, and this is a PSA to me as well as it is to you. Don't let tier lists destroy you. And I'm saying this to myself in the future because I know I'll be watching more tier list videos and I'll be seeing some class that I'm not playing at the #1 spot and I'll be like, shit, I'm such a bad player. I keep choosing the wrong class. And you did choose the wrong class, but they're all wrong and for a different reason than you think. So thanks for watching. I've been Bram. You've been you. Please like and subscribe and have a good day.